House Carino's Sardaukar are not just soldiers, they are a legend. Elite warriors feared across the galaxy, the Sardaukar were the steel fist of the Padishah Emperors, enforcing the will of House Carino with ruthless precision. Clad in their menacing armor, they seemed unstoppable, the very embodiment of fear and control. But how did they become so feared, and why, despite their dominance, did they ultimately fall? Today, we will uncover the chilling truth behind the Sardaukar. From their brutal origins on the deadly prison planet of Salusa Secundus to the terrifying psychological tactics they used on the battlefield. This deep dive will reveal both the strength and the inherent flaws that led to their decline. We will explore the philosophy of fear that shaped them, the training that forged them, and the critical mistakes that turned them from the Empire's ultimate weapon into a symbol of its vulnerability. The Sardaukar's terrifying reputation begins on Salusa Secundus, a planet that can only be described as a crucible of death. Once a lush and thriving world, it was transformed into a harsh wasteland after the planet's devastation during ancient wars. Over time, the Carino family repurposed it, not as a symbol of loss, but as a tool of absolute control. Salusa became a prison planet, but not just any prison. It was a calculated experiment in human conditioning. Harsh storms, brutal wildlife, and near-toxic conditions meant only the strongest survived. Those who couldn't endure the harsh climate died quickly. Those who did, they were forged into something far more dangerous. The Carino emperors understood the psychological power of suffering. On Salusa, survival was not just physical but mental. The constant struggle against death bred a fanatical resilience and an unshakable belief in their own superiority. The Sardaukar believed they were chosen, forged by suffering to serve the divine will of the Emperor. This myth was carefully cultivated, an ideological foundation as important as their physical training. But it wasn't just the environment. Salusa's design was deliberate. The Carinos understood that by keeping the conditions horrific, they could create warriors with no empathy, no mercy, only a singular devotion to power. Entire generations were born and died on Salusa, knowing nothing but hardship and the doctrine of absolute loyalty. The Sardaukar were more than soldiers. They were living symbols of House Carino's power. Their presence on the battlefield wasn't just tactical. It was psychological warfare. They fought not just to win, but to break the spirit of entire populations. And yet, for all their strength, the seeds of their eventual downfall were already present in the very system that created them. From these harsh beginnings, the Sardaukar would rise to become the enforcers of imperial will, but as we will see, the philosophy that made them so fearsome would also lead to their ultimate defeat. Their combat philosophy was rooted in total domination, not just of the body but of the mind of their enemies. Every aspect of their appearance, behavior, and battlefield conduct was carefully engineered to inspire terror before a single strike was made. The core of their tactics revolved around the concept of overwhelming presence. When the Sardaukar deployed, they did so with calculated brutality. Their armor, dark, imposing, and intentionally unmarked, gave no hint of individuality. They moved in perfect formation, emphasizing unity over self. This uniformity reinforced the idea that the Sardaukar were not men but an unstoppable extension of the Emperor's will. On the battlefield, their tactics were as psychological as they were efficient. They did not merely defeat their opponents, they annihilated them with precision and spectacle. Executions were public. Displays of power meant to send a message: resist and you will be crushed without mercy. Yet it was their ruthlessness that defined them most. The Sardaukar were trained to show no hesitation in executing civilians, entire populations if necessary, as a means of reinforcing House Carino's supremacy. Their presence alone often broke rebellions before combat began, as fear of their arrival was enough to ensure compliance. But the Sardaukar's power was not just in brutality. It was in their conditioning. Their training emphasized pain tolerance and the destruction of personal will. Each Sardaukar was broken down psychologically during their training on Salusa Secundus, stripped of any identity outside their role as instruments of the Emperor's will. They became not individuals, but a collective weapon, conditioned to obey without question. This extreme psychological conditioning, however, was both a strength and a flaw. While it made the Sardaukar extraordinarily loyal, it also left them incapable of independent thought. In engagements where complex strategy or adaptation was required, they often faltered. Their philosophy of fear and brute force made them unstoppable against the unprepared, but vulnerable against those who could match them mentally. A prime example of this came during the fall of House Corrino. The Fremen, while fewer in number, possessed a form of psychological resilience that the Sardaukar could not comprehend. Raised in the harsh desert conditions of Arrakis, the Fremen had already endured struggles as intense as Salusa Secundus. More critically, they were driven not by fear but by faith, a spiritual belief in their prophetic destiny, tied to Pal Muad'Dib. The Sardaukar were unprepared for an enemy who could not be intimidated. The brutal tactics that had worked so well for generations failed when met with Fremen warriors who welcomed death in the service of their cause. This critical vulnerability in the Sardaukar's psychological warfare exposed the deeper flaw of House Corrino's power. Fear could subdue, but it could not inspire true loyalty. The Sardaukar's downfall was not merely a military defeat, but a philosophical one, as belief and faith proved more powerful than terror. The Sardaukar's existence allowed the Padishah Emperors to rule not through alliances or diplomacy, but through the constant looming threat of violence. Shaddam IV and his ancestors used the Sardaukar as the ultimate deterrent, a visible reminder that imperial authority could not be challenged without catastrophic consequences. This reliance on the Sardaukar as a tool of fear shaped the entire structure of the Imperium. The great houses of the Landsraad were allowed a measure of autonomy and wealth, but were kept in line through the constant reminder of the Emperor's ultimate power. The Sardaukar were not often deployed, but served instead as a symbolic threat, an invisible sword hanging over the heads of any who dared resist. However, this power was carefully masked. The brutal origins of the Sardaukar on Salusa Secundus were a closely guarded secret. Officially, the planet was known as a desolate prison world, but the truth, that it served as a breeding ground for the galaxy's deadliest warriors, was concealed from the broader Imperium. This secrecy was critical to maintaining the illusion of divine power. If the Sardaukar were ever revealed to be men forged from hardship rather than mystical champions, the perception of the Emperor's absolute authority could begin to crumble. This concealment strategy worked for centuries. House Corrino's ability to hold the Imperium together rested on two key factors: the fear of Sardaukar retaliation and the illusion that the Emperor's power was absolute. But this strategy came with a critical flaw. By relying so heavily on the Sardaukar, the Corrinos neglected the more subtle aspects of governance. Their rule was not based on cooperation, loyalty, or shared prosperity, but on enforced submission. This over-reliance was never more evident than in Shaddam IV's handling of House Atreides. When Duke Leto Atreides' popularity grew, threatening the Emperor's influence, Shaddam IV turned to the Sardaukar as his solution. He collaborated with House Harkonnen, using his elite force to secretly assist in the assault on Arrakis, believing that a decisive military strike would neutralize the threat. However, Shaddam underestimated the cultural and spiritual resilience of the Fremen. The Sardaukar, bred in brutal hardship, were prepared for physical warfare but not for the ideological battle they encountered on Arrakis. Shaddam's deployment of the Sardaukar backfired, as their invincibility was shattered on Arrakis, both physically and symbolically. When the Fremen defeated the Sardaukar in open combat, the illusion of the Corrinos' divine power crumbled. Ultimately, the Sardaukar's role in House Corrino's political strategy became their undoing. They were too visible, too closely tied to the Emperor's identity. Once defeated, the entire foundation of Corrino control collapsed. Without the Sardaukar as an unquestionable deterrent, Shaddam IV was left vulnerable, his authority exposed as hollow. This downfall raises a profound question about the nature of power. Can true authority be maintained through force alone, or does it require something deeper: faith, loyalty, and genuine respect? The decline of the Sardaukar was not an overnight collapse, but a slow erosion of their effectiveness and the very foundation of their mythos. While they had once been the galaxy's most feared warriors, their supremacy began to falter long before Paul Atreides arrived on Arrakis. The key factor in the Sardaukar's decline was generational complacency. As the Corrino dynasty continued its long reign, the harsh conditioning on Salusa Secundus weakened. The training remained brutal, but over time the conditions became more controlled, more calculated, diminishing the raw, unrelenting hardship that had forged the early Sardaukar. What once produced true survivalists devolved into a rigid, militarized order that had begun to rely more on reputation than raw effectiveness. The Corrinos, too, contributed to this decline by overestimating the psychological power of the Sardaukar. For centuries, they had ruled through fear, not by constantly deploying their forces, but by relying on the threat the Sardaukar represented. This reliance on symbolic power created a false sense of security, as the Sardaukar's presence was rarely tested in true conflict after generations of peace. However, the introduction of House Atreides and the Fremen presented a force the Sardaukar were unprepared to face. Paul Atreides had not only inherited his father's military genius, but had been trained in the ways of the Fremen, a people far more resilient and ideologically united than any the Imperium had faced before. The Fremen, like the Sardaukar of old, were molded by extreme conditions. But unlike the Sardaukar, their hardship had not been artificially imposed. It was their way of life, inseparable from their identity. The Sardaukar's decisive failure came during the final confrontation on Arrakis, where Paul Atreides led the Fremen in a direct assault against both House Harkonnen and the Emperor's elite guard. The desert-hardened Fremen, with their guerrilla tactics and spiritual conviction, overwhelmed the Sardaukar in ways that brute force alone could not counter. This battle exposed the Sardaukar's weaknesses to the entire Imperium. Once thought invincible, they were shown to be mortal, vulnerable, and no longer the terrifying force of legend. The psychological hold the Corrinos had maintained over the galaxy shattered. Shaddam IV, already losing favor with the Landsraad due to his secrecy and manipulations, found himself without the primary tool of his dominance. Paul's victory did not just signal a military triumph. It marked the collapse of an entire philosophy of power. The Corrino Empire, which had stood for millennia, was reduced to an outdated relic, incapable of adapting to the new realities of faith-driven power and decentralized strength. Shaddam IV, forced to surrender and abdicate, was not just defeated militarily, but ideologically. The fall of House Corrino highlights one of Frank Herbert's central themes: the danger of relying on fear as a foundation for leadership. Power sustained through terror alone is inherently fragile. When the Sardaukar failed, the entire myth of Corrino invincibility crumbled. Yet Herbert also leaves a cautionary message in Paul's rise. Though he succeeded in dismantling the Corrino model of power, his own reign as Muad'Dib revealed similar patterns of centralization and unchecked faith. While the Sardaukar were defeated, Paul's Fremen jihad became a force of galactic conquest, just as terrifying and far-reaching. The Sardaukar's decline thus serves as a narrative reflection on the cycles of power. Their fall reminds us that power rooted in violence and domination cannot last indefinitely, and yet history often replaces one form of control with another, equally dangerous model. The Sardaukar leave a profound and lasting legacy within the universe of Dune. Their rise, dominance, and eventual fall underscore the dangers inherent in militarized authority and the illusion of invincibility. Their ultimate downfall serves as a narrative turning point in Dune, revealing that no matter how fearsome a force may seem, it is not immune to decay. Dune's narrative warns that power's cyclical nature is not easily broken. Though the Sardaukar fell, the rise of Paul Atreides and his Fremen-led empire brought about a new form of militarized power, equally dangerous in its potential for unchecked violence. Paul's jihad, fueled by prophecy and religious fervor, spread across the galaxy with a force that rivaled, if not exceeded, that of the Sardaukar legions. Frank Herbert masterfully uses the Sardaukar to explore the philosophical tension between control and faith, between physical dominance and ideological influence. They serve as a cautionary tale. Even the most powerful tools of oppression can be undone by the emergence of a stronger cultural force. Their story reminds us that no empire is eternal, and the tools of oppression will always be vulnerable to the very forces they seek to suppress. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Sardaukar, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment as we continue our exploration of the rich universe of Dune. Thank you for watching this video, and as usual, remember, the spice must flow.